Maegavan and Melanine, and well met indeed. I am Arakir Galadirthan, the head of Divide and Conquer, the submod for 3rd Age Total War, submod for Med 2 Kingdoms. And here continuing with the lore series that I have been dibbling and dabbling throughout my time on YouTube. Today we come to the 4th part of the Battles of the 3rd Age, as there are so many. And to mark the 10,000 subscriber special, this one, well, I don't know if it will be an hour, it most likely will. It's going to cover the battles of the Hornburg and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, both of which take place in the late 3rd Age. But before I go into those and start the narrative, I do just want to mention, mostly for Cryo-Hellenic's benefit and any that use the headset, I've dabbled around with my USB adapter, and from what I can hear back, the static should now completely have gone again. So I'm really thrilled with that. So do let me know if you get that back to yourselves as well. But the static should now completely have gone, which will improve the recording quality, don mon opinion, in my opinion. So I just wanted to tick that box and get that out the way before we dive into these two great battles. Now there will be another video after this sometime in the future, and it'll be the final one, Battles Part 5, and that will be very short, I expect, because that will cover the last battles that people might want to know about, and that is the Ent Siege of Isengard, the Tower of Orthanc, and the Battle of Dale, the very little known battle that takes place at Erebor. And I'll cover those two in their own video, which will round out the battles of the 3rd Age. But let us begin. The Battle of the Hornburg will go first. Now, one caveat before we do dive in. I will, throughout this, highlight the points where the film and the books differ substantially. But I will just say that I absolutely love the films. It is not me bashing the films, saying they're stupid, saying they did the wrong thing. It is purely me highlighting to you where the actual differences lie. So I may scorn certain decisions, such as the elves of Helms Deep, but it's not in a hatred way. The Fellowship of the Ring is my favourite film of all time, and the two subsequent films are up there as well. So just to say, I am a massive fan of the films. It's not me telling them they're idiots. It's purely just for information benefit, telling you where the differences lie. Okay. So the Battle of Helms Deep, the Battle of the Hornburg, takes place in its namesake valley, the Helms Deep, the Deep of Helm. Now Helms Deep is a geographical location, and the Hornburg is the name of the actual fortress. That's a distinction that many people don't get, actually. Of course, Helms Deep and Helms Dike, by extension, which we'll talk about in a moment, are both named after Helm Hammerhand, the king of Rohan in ages past, who sadly perished in the Deep, and that region takes his name. You can hear about him in the Rohan video that I did. So, Helms Deep. Who and what happens at the Battle of Helms Deep? Well, of course, the Battle of Helms Deep marks arguably one of the first key decisive battles in the War of the Ring, the famed year or so long period of warfare that embroils all of Middle-earth. Unlike World War I and II in our time, which actually were kind of like Europe War I and Europe plus the Colonies War II, this one is actually a war that covers almost the entire continent. Every single nation on the face of Middle-earth, by some way or another, is involved in the War of the Ring. And the Helms Deep, the Battle of Helms Deep, is the first key battle. Of course, there are two belligerents, taken from the Latin belli, and in this case it is Saruman versus the aligned forces of good under arguably Gandalf, but de jure Theoden. So Gandalf might be the de facto leader of the forces of good, but in this case Theoden is the de jure leader. He's the legal leader. Of course, King Theoden is the king of Rohan, and with him is his nephew and heir, Éomer. Of course, as well, Aragorn, who has a hand in everything that good does throughout the fighting of the War of the Ring. Gandalf, as I've already mentioned, is a commander, and a lesser-known commander who is replaced by Éomer in the film is Erkenbrand of the Westfold, who will play a part in the campaign a little later on. Now, fighting against them in the Battle of the Hornburg is Saruman. But he, of course, doesn't lead the army. He controls the army, and he's the head of the army of Isengard, but he doesn't physically lead the army at the battle. We don't know who does. It's an unknown Uruk who would have led the army. And now I also hear you ask, what armies make up the two sides? Now the numbers here are difficult to pin down, but we can suggest that there may have been a total of 17,000 forces of evil. And I choose those words because it's a combination of Uruk-hai, Orcs, half-Orcs, and of course Dunlendings. And there's about 17-odd thousand, maybe 15,000 to 17,000 of the enemy. Now fighting against them, and this is where the key difference comes at the Battle of Helms Deep, are 3,000 or so men of Rohan. No elves. The elves do not go to Helms Deep. But I do think that that was a good change, actually, and I thought it was a nice little addition, because it was really cool when they blew their horn and walked up the causeway, and they were marched in that perfect order. I thought it was awesome. But the elves don't actually go to Helms Deep. It's only Rohan on its own. Its army composition is also broken down further, with about 2,000 people defending Helms Deep itself, and 1,000 people arriving later with Gandalf. So what happens before the lead up to Helms Deep? Well, there's very, very little, of course, and it's very similar to the movie, in that Theoden is freed from the evil grasp of Grima Wormtongue, the servant of Saruman, and upon being freed, he immediately musters what force he can and heads out to the fords of Aizen. Now, the fords of Aizen are the fords over the River Aizen, and they mark the boundary between Isengard and Rohan, and they head out there to try and support any defenders that they may have that are still fighting at the fords of Aizen. However, when they arrive, they learn that the forces there have been completely scattered. Erkenbrand, their commander, he meets with them, and they learn that the forces have all been scattered, they've been routed, and a vast army is on its way to head into Rohan. So Gandalf and Theoden take counsel, and they decide to pull back to Helm's Deep, but Gandalf stays out with the intention of mustering as many men as he can to come to the aid of Helm's Deep. But Gandalf shall be the hammer and the Hornburg shall be the anvil, is their hope. But they are severely outnumbered, and hope is something that is in short supply at this time. So then we come to the battle itself. Now, also, sorry, disclaimer, there will be some images from the movies because there's hardly any images of these battles. So there's quite a lot of images from the films. So if you are actually watching and rather than just listening, there'll be some film images. So the actual battle itself takes place. Now, before the army of the Orcs arrives at the Hornburg, they first have to claim the defences of Helm's Dike. Now, a dike is kind of like a really small valley, like a ditch almost, and it runs the length of the entranceway into Helm's Deep, which is the cleft or the valley in between the mountain, with sheer sides as you see in the image there. And the dike marks the entrance to Helm's Deep, and this is defended by the men of Rohan. And Theoden keeps a guard there to hope that they can either A, warn them when the enemy's coming, and maybe even try and stop the enemy. They're still not sure the size of the force that's coming against them. But the forces of evil arrive at the dike, and they take it in really quickly. They overrun it. Their numbers are monstrous in comparison to the defenders of the dike, and the Orcs plough through. But they do take severe losses, it is said. So they've already taken a blow before they've arrived at the Hornburg, and the defenders of Rohan are certainly defending with everything they've got. Right, when the Orcs actually arrive at the Hornburg, there's no sign of defenders anywhere. The walls are completely bare. There's no lights, there's nothing. It just looks like a completely empty fortress. And so the Orcs begin showering arrows up onto the wall and into the keep itself. And nothing happens. So then they slowly start advancing towards the Hornburg, and when they get within reach of the walls, the defenders suddenly arise, and a hail of arrows flies from the fortress itself. Rocks are thrown from every single point of the wall they can be, and the Orcs flee in panic. Despite their sheer size, Orcs inherently are cowardly, and even in vast numbers, they are still likely to rout and break in pockets here and there. And that's true of this. The Orcs push forward, and as soon as they're met with an onslaught, with an actual foe, they immediately retreat. And they pull back. But then this back and forth continues for a little while, with the Orcs raining arrows and moving forward and getting pushed back and moving forward and getting pushed back, until eventually they get close to the gate. Now the gate attack comes before the ladders are put up. So, with their constant ebb and flow of the forces getting closer to the gate, trying to rain arrows down on the defenders, they eventually send a battering ram up to the gate itself. And I've got an image of the ladders and the gate just there, with the gate away in the background. And the battering ram goes up the causeway and it goes up toward the gate, and there's more than one battering ram, there's quite a few, and they're made out of trees that they've knocked down on the way there. But as they arrive at the gate, a small rabble of defenders emerges from a postern gate and begins destroying every battering ram in sight and killing all of the defenders. This again is a departure from the film, because it's Aragorn and Éomer who lead the charge out of the side gate. But Gimli does go as well, because Aragorn and Éomer lead a small group of men, they're not on their own, and they fight back the defenders of the battering rams. They beat the Uruk-hai down and they destroy the rams. But as they are retreating back to the postern gate, a few orcs who had pretended to be dead suddenly rise up and they trip Éomer and they begin bundling on top of him. Aragorn is too far away and he tries to run back to save him, but then, out of seemingly nowhere, Gimli arrives and he cleaves the head clean off of all the Uruks on top of Éomer, thus saving his life and repaying Éomer for the help he showed them when they were the three hunters, obviously earlier on their way from Fangorn, or to Fangorn. But the defenders then rush back into the postern gate, and so the gate is maintained. But now come the ladders. The ladders come in their hundreds. They cover the wall. They absolutely cover the wall. And the beleaguered defenders manage to push almost all of them off the wall. So again, a detraction from the film whereby you see the berserkers landing on the wall and slaying Rohirrim by the 100. Like each swing kills about 3 or 4. Although it's elves in the film. But whereas in truth, the ladders are almost rejected immediately. The ladders land and the defenders push them all down. But the small culvert that covers the small stream that leads out of the... I think it's called the Deep in Coombe, maybe. I'm not entirely certain. But the small stream that leads out of the Hornburg and down the valley, the small culvert at the base there is just a small hole in the rock. And there's a minor metal grate. But the orcs easily break through the small gate and they come at the defenders from the rear. They surprise the defenders who are currently busy pushing the ladders down, and then the orcs are suddenly on the wall with them, even though they've not climbed the ladders, and the defenders can't see how. And it's at this moment that Gimli, along with Gamling the Old, one of the defenders of Rohan, they surge with some defenders and they beat back the orcs at the culvert. And not only do they beat them back, but they also then block it up entirely. Gamling, it has to be said, is one of the garrison commanders of the Hornburg, and he's one of the governors of the Westfold. And there's a small group of men of the Westfold with him and Gimli, and they fight back the orcs, and they push them back through the culvert, and then they block it up. However, then comes that which you all know and fear, and I can tell you that it is entirely true. It does happen in the book as well. Saruman's Fire of Orthanc, or Saruman's Devilry are the two names of it. Either Saruman's Devilry or the Fire of Orthanc is placed in this now very nice little walled up hole, so it's got something to rest up against. Now, a brief little talk about the Fire of Orthanc, the explosion. And that is that, first and foremost, in the film they're depicted as bombs, but in the book it's described a little bit more like a kind of blasting powder, or almost like some sort of magical force almost. Whereas it is a physical thing, it's something that has been cooked up. And obviously in the film you get the big large round bombs and then they pour the thing on top, but in the books it's a little uncertain as to how it's actually applied to the wall, what kind of method they do use. But it is likely just barrels, in the same way that gunpowder is stored in barrels, and if you set a light to the barrel the gunpowder explodes. It's that kind of thing. Additionally, when talking about it, I came across a note that someone suggested that maybe the Númenóreans actually invented gunpowder, and that Sauron took this skill back with him when he was kicked out of Númenor by the destruction of the island, and then maybe Saruman got it from that somehow. But I think it's actually more accurate to say that Saruman, by his own devices, invents or discovers blasting powder. I don't think there's a Númenórean influence. I think it's just Saruman's. He's an incredibly talented man. He's close to Aule, the Valar of creation and smith work and forgery, and I think he just comes up with it. But back to the battle at hand. The gap in the wall is vast, and the orcs pour through like a tide, like the great ocean itself, blasting through the wall. And now the defenders at the base are now Éomer, Gimli, Gamling and the men around them. And as they are fighting, they are unfortunately beaten back into the glittering caves. And this is where we come to our third detraction from the film. The glittering caves are actually behind the deeping wall. They're not in the keep. The keep has no access to the caves. The caves themselves are down on the floor, on the ground, behind the deeping wall. And Éomer, Gimli and Gamling are pushed back into the glittering caves with all the defenders they have down there. Now Aragorn and Legolas and Theoden and the defenders of the keep, they pull back to the keep. So now we have a split in our good heroes. Éomer, Gimli and Gamling are in the caves with the larger contingent of men, and Theoden, Legolas and Aragorn are in the keep with a much smaller contingent of men. But now that they've been beaten back, the orcs have free reign. But before they all get back into the keep, as Aragorn is fighting his way back up to the keep, because he goes up the causeway from the deeping wall to the keep, he gets tripped and gets bundled upon again, in much in the same way Éomer does. But he's saved by Legolas, and some defenders on the walls above throw rocks down and kill all the orcs. And Legolas rushes to his aid and saves him. And at this time, Aragorn then stands up and he cries aloud to the orcs and he says, "Surrender now or you will all die." Of course, this cry is made very strangely, and he's more relying on his power, his innate power as a descendant of the kings of Númenor, to give strength to his words and force the orcs to flee. But of course, the orcs just laugh at him. The enemy is now trapped in the caves in the keep. The orcs outnumbered them at the beginning already more than 5-1 anyway, and now he's trying to say if they don't surrender they're going to die, and the orcs laugh him off and they fire arrows at him as he flees, so it comes to nothing. But now that the orcs have free reign of the citadel and the castle itself, they pile up their blasting powder against the gate itself. So they don't ram it down with a battering ram, they put blasting powder against the gate as well. And they destroy the gate. In a second explosion, Helms Deep's gate and the arch above it all crumbles. But at that exact moment, or maybe a little bit after, Theoden and Aragorn, upon their mighty steeds, charge out of the keep, leading the defenders with them on foot. The horn of Helm Hammerhand blasts throughout the deeping valley, and the defenders are beaten back. In sudden onset, the sheer force and spirit of the charge of Theoden and Aragorn and those amongst them creates panic amongst the orcs, and they begin fleeing. And seeing that the orcs are in disarray, Éomer, Gimli and Gamling all burst out of the glittering caves as well, and all the defenders start surging towards the orcs, led by Theoden, their king, atop Snowmane, his steed. Now it is suggested that only Theoden and Aragorn are actually on horses, and everyone else runs out on foot. And there's some credence to that. But the orcs then run down the valley. They flee all the way back to Helm's Dike, because of course Helm's Dike is a defence against people coming into the valley and a defence against people trying to leave. So the orcs then set up a defence at Helm's Dike. But it is then that from the far reaches of Rohan, or further deeper into the Westfold, that Gandalf and Erkenbrand finally arrive. And there's a particularly eerie picture of them, but I thought it was quite cool. So Gandalf arrives on Shadowfax, and with him is Erkenbrand, defender of the Westfold, who's said to have potential links in his bloodline to Helm Hammerhand himself, but that's unfounded. But Erkenbrand and Gandalf have managed to gather about 1,000 men, and they arrive just as the orcs arrive at Helm's Dike. So now what the orcs thought was going to be their defence against the defenders suddenly becomes their prison, as they're beset on both sides. And with the forces of Gandalf behind and the forces of Theoden in front, the two forces merge them together and start pushing the orcs away from Rohan, away from Helm's Deep, sorry. And then the final nail in the coffin comes, as the Huorns of Fangorn Forest finally arrive. The word is Huorns, and it's Huorns. And these are the sentient trees of Fangorn Forest. So they're not as able-bodied as the Ents, who are a race of beings that resemble trees. The Huorns are sentient trees. That genuinely is their description. And much as you see in the extended version of the film, the Huorns essentially cover the entire end of the valley, making it look like a great forest has sprung up out of nowhere. But the Orcs are in panic, they're in disarray, their leaders are dead, they're being attacked from the front and the side. It certainly is going ill, and they have no choice but to run into this now suddenly appeared forest, and this marks the destruction of almost every single Orc. The Huorns spare none, for they remember greatly the pain suffered upon Fangorn Forest at the hands of the Uruks and their axes, and the Huorns slay them all. Now the Dunlendings, though, there is a side little note here. The Dunlendings actually surrender, they don't charge into the forest, and Erkenbrand comes up to them and he commands them to lay down their arms, and this they do. But then he also makes them swear an oath that they will never again trouble the lands of Rohan. Now whether or not that actually happens we don't know, but in that moment the Dunlendings all agree and they actually survive and they return home. And it's said that the Dunlendings are allowed to gather up their dead and they bury them in a great communal mound which forever commemorates their misdeeds. However, the bodies of the Uruks are just piled up at the side of the valley and left to rot. They don't even set fire to them, they don't even give them that courtesy. And so ends the Battle of the Hornburg. The entire battle from start to finish only lasts an evening and a morning. It runs through the night, but it's a very, very small, short battle. And there isn't a particular aftermath, but one thing I did just want to mention, there's no aftermath because the war, of course, is ongoing, so there's no real deciding factor yet. The one thing I would mention, or two things rather, firstly, Gimli and Legolas do actually have a competition, and Gimli wins it 42 to 41. However, Gimli actually takes quite a severe blow to his head during the fighting, and he has to be bandaged up, but he does survive. Additionally, Hammer, the gate guard of Meduseld, the chief, or the captain of Theoden's personal guard, in the film he is killed by the Warg attack. When the Wargs attack and those two men ride out at the front and one of the Wargs jumps down and bites his head off, that's Hammer. But in the books he actually dies in Helms Deep itself. So that's just a minor little change there. But that is the Battle of the Hornburg, and that's how it actually takes place. There aren't any elves, and the defenders beat back the Uruk-hai on their own with sheer strength and willpower, and the intervention of some key heroes at key moments. But it certainly seems that luck smiled upon the defenders that day, I can tell you. So then we come on to battle number 2, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, a far greater and grander battle, and the very decisive moment in the War of the Ring that flips the tables, and Sauron becomes on the back foot. Now again, this happens very much like it does in the movie, but there are some key omissions, and I will also cover them as we go through the narrative. But the Pelennor Fields are they're the fields directly outside of Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith itself lies in the land of Anorion, which you can just see there if you can see my mouse cursor, just north of the White Mountains, the Ered Nimreis. And Anorion used to be part of Calanarthon, but of course Calanarthon became Rohan, and Anorion was maintained by Gondor. So it marks the border between Gondor and Rohan, and Minas Tirith and the Pelennor Fields lie within Anorion. It means Sunlands, if you're interested. But, so that's our location, that's the setting. Of course, the pre-battle also takes place in Osgiliath and at the Ramas Echor, which I'll describe a little in a moment. So, who have we got leading the two sides in this battle? Well, I've not done a screenshot for either of these battles of who leads them because there's just too many people. But leading the forces of good in this battle are, of course, Gandalf. He is the chief architect of the forces of good in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. To an extent, Denethor as well, but he abandons his charge, as we'll see, and so Gandalf takes over. I would suggest that second most prominent is Theoden himself as the leader of the Riders of Rohan. And then thirdly, of course, Aragorn, who comes by way of ship. Supporting Aragorn is Halbarad of the Dunedain, and he's the commander of the Grey Company. Supporting Theoden is, of course, Eomer, his steadfast nephew and defender in all things. And supporting Gandalf and Denethor in the city itself is, of course, the mighty Prince Imrahil, son of Adrahil of Dol Amroth, uncle to both Boromir and Faramir, and brother-in-law to Denethor, the steward himself. Imrahil plays a large part in the fates of Gondor. But also supporting Gondor and from the fiefdoms arriving at Minas Tirith are Herluin the Fair, all the way from Pinnith Gelin, Forlong of Lossarnac, Forlong the Fat he's known as, Dwyn here of the Blackroot Vale with his sons, Dwylin and Dwyn someone else, I can't remember his name. Galasgil of... where's Galasgil from? Lond Gallen, I think, and Falas. And finally, Derverin. And those are the defenders of the fiefdoms who make up the defence of Minas Tirith. And arrayed against them, the two commanders, the standout commanders, are the Witch King of Angmar, the head of the army of evil. The Kamal, the Easterling, the only other named Nazgul, also plays a part in the battle. Of course, all other 7 Nazgul are actually present, but they don't have particularly leadership roles, they're just there fighting. And Gothmog, the lieutenant of the Witch King. Now, to touch on Gothmog, actually, no one is 100% certain who or what he is. The universally agreed upon opinion is that he is an orc, but there is a school of thought that he might well be a Black Númenórean as well, to coincide with the mouth of Sauron. But we don't really know who or what he is, and it's quite fitting for him to be an orc, so that's the prevailing opinion. But also leading the forces of evil is a man known only as, I believe, the Black Serpent of Harad. And he's the chieftain of Harad. He's never given a name. I think he's just called the Serpent, something to that effect. He has a big red banner with a black snake on it. And he leads the forces of Harad, but he doesn't do too much, really, other than die. Spoiler alert. But so those are the key combatants and the belligerents in the war. So what happens before the war? Well, of course, the major event before the war is the lighting of the beacons. This marks the start of the events of the Pellinore Fields. News, of course, has reached Gondor and Sauron of Saruman's defeat, and Sauron, seeing that Saruman is now lost and Rohan are not the weak force he was hoping they'd be, he decides to attack a little earlier than he was going to. So Sauron rushes his forces into battle. And Gondor, this is where one of our first key changes from the films comes. Denethor has not yet lost his mind. He does lose his mind, but he's not the downright coward that he's made out to be. And Denethor himself commands the lighting of the beacons and are calls to aid from the surrounding fiefs. But to touch on the beacons as we're just speaking of them, the beacons themselves are actually used more to alert the fiefdoms that Minas Tirith needs aid, that Anorion is under attack. A messenger with a red arrow is sent to Rohan to tell them to come to Gondor. But then that is then reasonably conflicting because the beacons are on the northern side of the mountain. So they do go through Anorion and then into Calenathan, but they're mostly used just to alert the fiefdoms to come to the aid of Gondor. And then a messenger with a red arrow arrives in Rohan to tell them to come. So I'm not sure what the beacons are even for, to be honest. Maybe just to call people from Anorion and eastern Calenathan or eastern Rohan into Minas Tirith. But there we are. So Denethor lights the beacons, and Gondor calls for aid. Now, the very next day comes the start, kind of the chronological start of the Pelennor Fields battle, and that is the Dawnless Day. Now, it's called the Dawnless Day because Sauron sends forth a great smog, a cloud, a covering of the sky itself. And so when the sun arises, nothing arises. This black, thick fog covers the sky and is sent to less to cover the sun and more to actually instill fear into the defenders of Minas Tirith, and this it does with great skill. The defenders are terrified at the sight of this almighty storm above them. But the Dawnless Day takes place, I believe, on the 11th of March 3019, and the battle itself takes place on the 14th of March 3019. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields is 10 days after the Battle of the Hornburg. That's the gap between the two. But then the next key event is a major event, and again it happens slightly differently, and that is the felling of Faramir. Unlike in the film where Denethor sends Faramir away because he wants him to die, because he wants Boromir alive and he's losing his mind, Faramir just goes to defend Osgiliath because it makes sense to try and hold the orcs at the river. So Faramir heads out to Osgiliath with his defenders, and they try to hold Osgiliath, and they fail. They are beaten back mercilessly, and Faramir pulls everyone back to something called the Causeway Forts. And the Causeway Forts are two great towers and the gateway into the Ramas Ekor. And this is another major distinction between the books and the films. Minas Tirith itself and the Pelennor Fields are surrounded by a monumental wall. So Minas Tirith has got its layers and its 7 walls or whatever, and the lowest one is the black stone. But further out from that, protecting the Pelennor Fields themselves, is a vast wall ringing Minas Tirith in, and this is known as the Ramas Echor, which translates quite literally to outer wall. That's what it means. But Faramir pulls back to this vast wall. Now, the Ramas Echor was built some time ago with great skill, the skill of Númenor, and it's thought that it could never fall. But because Faramir has so few defenders, the sheer size of the Orcs means that, unfortunately, it does. But as Faramir is fleeing even from the Ramas Echor, he is felled by a poisoned arrow from the Southrons, not from the Orcs, from the Southrons. And seeing that they are in trouble, Prince Imrahil, commander and governor of Dol Amroth, leader of the Knights of the Silver Swan, charges forth from Minas Tirith with Gandalf at his side and a retinue of Swan Knights, and they charge thundering through the battlefield. Although there's no battle yet, but they charge through the Pelennor Fields and they come to the aid of those fleeing the Ramas Echor. And Imrahil picks Faramir up, tends to his wounds, mounts him on his horse, and he rides him back to Minas Tirith. Faramir doesn't just come back at the being dragged by his horse. But then this is the key moment for Denethor. This is when Denethor finally does twitch and become the twisted mental Denethor we know. He can see this vast horde arrayed against him now. The Orcs have all come through the Ramas Echor and they're marching to Minas Tirith. They can be seen. And Faramir arrives apparently mortally wounded. Now, everyone with sense realises that Faramir is not going to die. And even Denethor realises that Faramir isn't dead, but he thinks he's going to die. And he doesn't think they can save him. And this is when Faramir retreats into the White Tower itself, takes Faramir with him, and abandons the city. He doesn't even give orders, he just abandons the city. And Gandalf and Imrahil then take over together as in command of the city. And so the battle ensues, with Gandalf and Imrahil leading the forces of good within the walls, and the Orcs on the other side. And the siege of Minas Tirith takes place. Now, the siege begins with catapult fire. The Orcs start firing their catapults at the city. But the outer wall, the lower wall, is built of the same impenetrable rock that Orthanc is built from. And it's jet black. And the catapults have no effect. The rocks bounce off as if they were a bouncy ball just pressing against hard wood. And so the Orcs are a little dismayed. So instead they start firing their catapults over the wall. And they begin burning the lower level with their flaming shots. But the Orcs, of course, have to get in. They're not going to do any damage if they're just sitting outside the wall. And a vast archer exchange takes place. Thousands of Orcs are slain by the numerous defenders on the walls. But many Gondorians lose their lives as well. It's also, I forgot to mention, so a little recap. It's estimated that the combined force of good in this fight is around 30,000. And the combined forces of evil, the Orcs, the Variags, the Southrons, the Easterlings, any Uruk-hai of Mordor, the entirety of the evil forces is estimated at 200,000. So again, they're outnumbered here 6 to 1. Almost, what would that be? 6.66 to 1. An outrageous sum. So it's a very, very against them. But a big archer exchange takes place as the catapults begin burning the lower levels. The Nazguls, it also should be said, tend to ride horses in this battle actually rather than fell beasts. And they're just part of the mingling crowd. But then the key event comes with the Hammer of the Underworld. Grond is its name, and it is named after Morgoth's weapon from the First Age, which was called the Hammer of the Underworld, and so such is Grond. Now Grond itself, the portrayal in the film is pretty darn good actually, because the thing is said to be huge, absolutely massive. I read something that said it was 100 feet long, but I can't remember. I didn't verify if that was in the book, so I didn't really want to touch on it. But if it is that, that's astounding. But what we do know is it took a team of trolls just to pull the thing back. And it had to be pulled by great beasts of Mordor. It couldn't even be pushed by orcs or trolls. It was huge. But they knew that it was reasonably defenseless, so the siege towers of the Orcs do ride up to the walls of Minas Tirith, but they're used more as a decoy more than anything, because the Orcs climbing the siege towers takes time, and the defenders can bottleneck each tower quite easily. And of course the archers of the Orcs are unlikely to fire in if they're just going to be killing their own army. So the siege towers are more decoys, and Grond trundles its way through towards the gate itself. The gate is of Númenorian origin and craftsmanship, and thus is almost impenetrable, which is why the minor battering rams have no effect. But Grond does. And Grond smashes through the gate in only 3 swings. Really easily breaks down this gate. And at the head of the Orcish army, the Witch King of Angmar, atop a great black steed, he marches into the city. And at the sight of him, every single Gondorian defender flees, bar one. Gandalf. Gandalf, atop Shadowfax, stands firm in the courtyard of Minas Tirith and defies the Witch King. But something even greater happens then that defies the Witch King even more. And that is that the horns of the Rohirrim sound atop the hills to the west, the hills to the north of Minas Tirith. The Rohirrim had come. Now the arrival of the Rohirrim is a huge deciding factor. And that is for a number of reasons. Number one, there are about 6,000 Rohirrim, which is enough for a cavalry to do a heavy charge into the Orcs. And the morale effect of a cavalry charge of that size will have a huge knock-on effect through the army, and you'll get a mass rout. But more importantly, the arrival of the Rohirrim was anticipated by none. Part of the reason why Denethor abandons all hope is because he looks away to the north at the northern gate of the Ramas Ekor, and he sees that the Orcs have actually barricaded it up. They have placed a great line of stakes across the road, and they hold the gate. Now the Rohirrim won't have any siege equipment with them, and it will be absolute suicide to charge through onto stakes. So all of the Gondorian defenders, Gandalf included, think that the Rohirrim will not come. They think that Minas Tirith is almost bound to fall. And by extension, the Orcs don't think Rohan will come, because they're defending this gate. But the Rohirrim do come, thanks to the Druidine hunters of Druiden Forest, the Woses, the Pukal men, led by Garn Buri Garn. Now, the Druidine are very much a footnote on history and forgotten by everyone. Even the Rohirrim had forgotten about them. There's tales of Druiden Forest being a place of witchcraft, and no one dare venture there, for they never return. But the Rohirrim have no choice. And Garn Buri Garn arrives, and he barely speaks any English. And he leads them through a forgotten valley that goes round behind the wall and brings them out on the Pellinore Fields. And it's called the Stone Wain Valley. And Garn Buri Garn is the only one who really has memory of this valley. The Rohirrim and Gondorians have since forgotten. And he leads the whole host of Rohan by secret paths to the Pellinore Fields. And they sweep away the defenders of the gate at the north of the tip of Ramas Ekor, and they claim the entire northern side of the Pellinore Fields. And it is at this time that the Rohirrim as well they fight against the Southron cavalry. Before the Mimikil arrive, they fight against the Southron cavalry, and Theoden himself kills the chieftain of the Southrons, which routs the Haradrim cavalry. So the Rohirrim have arrived, and this forces the Orcs and the Witch King to abandon Minas Tirith. So Gandalf stands there and defies the Witch King, but as the horns of Rohan sound, the Witch King pulls his forces away to form up against the Rohirrim, because you can't have your flank completely unprotected as you try and march into a city. It'll cut off your attackers in the city and they'll be slain. So the Witch King pulls away, and the Rohirrim charge through the Orcish ranks. They rout the Haradrim cavalry, and the fight then becomes a great battle for survival, as Rohan has evened the odds somewhat. However, then sadness grips everyone, for Theoden is slain. The Witch King abandons his horse and mounts his fell beast, and he flies into the ranks of the Rohirrim and he kills Theoden. Now, of course, he actually inflicts a wound upon Theoden. He severely injures him, but Snowmane, Theoden's horse, crushes Theoden to death. There's no, in the book, there's no suggestion of a talk between him and Éowyn. He just dies, having not known that Éowyn was there all along. And Éowyn slices the head off of the Fellbeast. The Fellbeast falls, the Witch King stands up unharmed, and the fight takes place exactly as it does in the film. Merry stabs the Witch King in the leg with his barrow blade, the work of Westerness, which allows the Witch King to then be killed by Éowyn. Thus Glorfindel's prophecy from the First Age comes true, for not by the hand of man will the Witch King fall, but by Éowyn's. And Éowyn slays the Witch King And the forces of evil take this really badly. The Orcs begin a vast mass rout. But seeing that things are going ill, Gothmog, the lieutenant, he summons what defences and what troops they have left in Osgiliath, and he throws them into battle. But, seeing the Witch King die and Faden fall, the Rohirrim are renewed with a vigour. They're out for vengeance, and Éomer rallies the Rohirrim and charges into the fleeing ranks. At the same time, the defenders of Minas Tirith, led by, again, Prince Imrahil, the mighty commander of Dol Amroth, and Gandalf, they charge out of Minas Tirith into the battle itself. And the two forces meet on the field. You've got the men of Gondor, led by the Knights of Dol Amroth, and the men of Rohan, led by Éomer, and they fight together against the foe. So again, this is another detraction from the film, whereby we see Gandalf and Pippin have that talk about what happens when you die, and this is not the end. The grey rain cloud of this world peels back, and blah blah blah. And the Orcs are banging on the second level of the door. The Orcs actually never enter the city. The Witch King is as far as they go before they're then pushed out at the coming of the Rohan, and then the defenders leave the city. So everyone on the second, fourth, third, fifth, sixth, and seventh levels are all safe. But the battle then starts to turn again. The defenders, of course, are renewed. They've got a vengeance out for Theoden, and with the Rohan there and the Gondorians together, they can kill many, many Orcs. But the Southrons, the Haradrim, the Variags of Khand, and the very Mumakil themselves, they are not as dismayed by the death of the Witch King as the Orcs are, because the Witch King to them isn't really anything. And they're out for blood. They're a savage, cruel race of evil men from the east and south. And, of course, they've got the Mumakil backing them up, and many forces of good do get killed, and the battle again switches. The Orcs can rally once more, because the Orcs make up the bulk of the force. The Orcs rally once more behind the fierce men of Khand, the men of Rhûn, the men of Harad, and the Mumakil, and they begin to fight back and win again, pushing the defenders and the Rohirrim back. Until the final deciding factor. The ships of Umbar arrive. Now, this is again another major detraction from the book and the film. This one is huge. The army of the dead is mustered by Aragorn, and he rides south to the mouth of the Anduin, the Aethir Anduin, where he meets Angbor the Fearless, or at that time, Angbor. Now, Angbor governs most of the men of the southern fiefdoms. He has something around 15,000 men that didn't go to Minas Tirith, because all the while the Battle of the Pellinore Fields takes place, the Umbrian and the Haradrim are actually invading southern Gondor. They are crossing the mouths of the Anduin in force on an attempt to come to Gondor by land, and Angbor is holding them back. Now, Aragorn arrives with the army of the dead, and all the Gondorians flee before the army, except for Angbor, and this earns him the epithet the Fearless. And Aragorn, with the army of the dead, then kill all of the sailors in the Umbrian fleet and aid the defenders of those who had crossed by land. But this is where the change comes. The army of the dead don't go to Minas Tirith. Aragorn lets them go after they have killed everyone on the ships. And once the ships are clear, the army of the dead's oath is fulfilled and they go then. So getting into the ships is Aragorn, as many Gondorians as he can fit into the ships, and the Grey Company, who are omitted from the film altogether. And the Grey Company is a number of about 30 or so Dunedain from the north, led by Halbarad and the twin sons of Elrond. Elladan and Elrohir are totally omitted from the film, which is a bit of a shame really, but because they're pretty cool. But they go with the Grey Company, and they go to Minas Tirith with Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Halbarad. So Aragorn comes to Minas Tirith with as many men as he can fit in the ships, but it only amounts, I think, to about 5,000-ish men. And Angbor then marches north with the rest of the army. He leaves a small garrison at the mouths of the Anduin, but he comes to Minas Tirith with about 7,000 or so men. But he doesn't arrive till long after the battle's ended. But with the arrival of Aragorn, again, it's as much the morale dampening effect as it is the arrival of Aragorn that actually sways the battle. Because the Orcs expect, and the men of the south are expecting the forces of Umbar to arrive, and instead the King of Gondor arrives with a new banner unfurled before him, displaying his new heraldic emblems, which is that of the King of both Arnor and Gondor. It's actually Arwen who makes this banner for him, and it is a banner in the likeness of Elendil. And so seeing this banner, the king is reclaiming his very throne, massively boosts the defenders. The men of the Gondorians and the Rohirrim see the banner of the king of both Arnor and Gondor. They see the king beneath it, with this new host of Gondorians fresh, ready for battle, and the fact that the Umbrian aren't coming has a huge boost to the defenders and a massive detraction from the attackers. And the battle is won. But before the battle is won, the men of Gondor do pay dearly for their victory, because Kamal, the Easterling, and Gothmog both rally as many orcs as they can around them, and they fight to the death. Now, of course, Kamal can't actually be killed in the same way as the others. It's a very sketchy area why the Witch King can die and the others can't. It's very unknown, but Kamal flees and he dies when the ring's destroyed. But Gothmog and him rally armies together, and they slay hundreds of defenders before they go down. Additionally, a group of corsairs who have a bitter hatred for Gondor, and they came by foot, or they came with the original army of Haradrim and Southrons. They get trapped against the Anduin itself and the defenders on the other side, and they fight to the last man. They fight to the death, and they take a lot of defenders with them. So whilst it is a victory for the defenders of Gondor, it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's not a Pyrrhic victory for Gondor in its entirety, as Angbor commands more defenders than ever actually defended Minas Tirith at the battle itself. It's even said that when the army then marches off to the Black Gate, Minas Tirith is then left with more defenders than it had when it fought off the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, which is astounding. So for Gondor as an entire entity, it's a phenomenal victory. It's a heroic victory. But for the defenders who actually defended Minas Tirith, it is a Pyrrhic victory. AMS says that of his 6,000 riders, 4,000 of those can no longer go on and fight at the Black Gate. That's 2/3 of his army incapacitated, either dead or injured, which is astounding. But of course, the battle ends. The forces of evil are routed, many of them are killed, but many of them do escape as they hold Osgiliath and they flee back to the Black Gate. Again, there is no real aftermath to this battle, save for because the aftermath comes at the end of the War of the Ring. But the aftermath directly out of this battle is, of course, Éomer becomes the king of Rohan, Aragorn becomes the king of Gondor, Denethor does die, similar in the way that he does in the film. He doesn't run off the cliff, but he does burn himself to death. And, oh, of course, so Gandalf, when I said Imrahil charges out with the defenders of Gondor, Gandalf isn't with them, because Gandalf goes off with Pippin to save Faramir, which happens very similar to the book, to the film. So, side note there. But, Aragorn becomes king, Éomer becomes king, but for a short time, Imrahil is actually made the steward of Gondor, and he serves as a steward in Faramir's stead, as he is unable to, as he's very unwell, of course. Additionally, Éowyn is mortally wounded, but not so. She's heavily wounded because Aragorn saves her life. And it's Imrahil that first notices that she's not actually dead, and then it's Aragorn that saves her life. For which, of course, Éomer is eternally grateful. Further to this, another outcome of this is Imrahil's daughter actually marries Éomer, the king of Rohan. So Imrahil then has fingers in every single pie. He's such a boss. But there we are. That concludes the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. It's a victory for the forces of good, but it's a hard fought and a Pyrrhic one. And all their hopes for survival now hang around Frodo's neck, and whether or not he can destroy the Great Ring. For they march on the Black Gate, but they know full well that their march on the Black Gate, if Frodo is dead or captured, is suicide. But of course, the Black Gate battle happens very much as it does in the film, and I believe as well I even covered what happens in the Black Gate in the Gondor video, so I won't cover that in the next one. It's not particularly a battle per se. Whilst it is, it's more of a distraction for Frodo's events. But that will conclude this episode. It's 10 minutes shy of an hour, but it covers the two big battles in depth. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope the sound quality has been better. Please feel free to leave any comments that you will. But until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Naden Perimad Melonin, Berio Irefen and Eilflin, Quiamai and farewell.